There's a moment every gardener and homesteader eventually faces, and it usually happens right around the first hard frost. You look out at the soil, once alive and warm, and well, you watch it tighten, crack and sink into a lifeless crust. For most people, that's the end of the season. They pack up the tools, stack the hoses, and wait for spring to fix what winter destroys. But the people who lived closest to the land in earlier centuries, northern settlers, high-latitude farmers, and mountain villagers, did not accept that seasonal surrender. They knew something modern growers often overlook. Soil doesn't need a break, it needs protection. And long before synthetic fertilizers existed, they relied on a winter-hardy cover crop that spread itself across the ground like a woven shield. Some called it a winter mat. Some called it a cold-field binder. Today we call it a living lattice. Now, before we get into the technique itself, I just want to set the hook clearly for the next minute or so, because honestly, this method really does deserve attention from anyone who's truly serious about building up their soil. You know, there's simply no off-season in the natural world. When winter comes along, the land doesn't just sleep. Instead, it quietly reflects the choices you made months before. If you leave your soil bare, well, the freeze will take its minerals, the wind will steal the top layer, and microbial life just collapses. But if you plant a living lattice, the structure holds. The soil stays anchored, fed, insulated, and alive. This isn't theory. It's something documented in old agrarian journals from Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and frontier America, where farmers depended on every inch of fertility to survive. The living lattice was a tool that allowed them to grow stronger crops in spring without adding a single purchased input. And today, with the cost of amendments climbing and the climate becoming unpredictable, this technique is more relevant than ever. So, what exactly is a living lattice? It's a cold-hardy cover crop blend that forms an interconnected web across the soil through winter. The traditional species varied by region, but rye, hairy vetch and winter peas were the backbone because, you know, they worked together instead of separately. Rye sprouted fast, rooting deeply and anchoring the soil. Vetch climbed and intertwined, with the rye fixing nitrogen while adding thick foliage. Winter peas wove themselves through the base layer, enriching the ground as they grew, and, well, later decomposed. The result was a cover that held together like a woven mat, flexible enough to withstand snow loads, resilient enough to survive repeated freezing, and dense enough to shade out weeds from the very start of the next season. The brilliance of the method lies in how these plants behave once temperatures drop. Rye continues pushing roots, even when the growth you see above ground slows to nothing. That hidden root network prevents frost heave erosion, which is one of the biggest winter soil killers. Meanwhile, the legumes in the mix keep fixing nitrogen until temperatures become too severe, and even then the nodules they produce persist until spring. When early farmers walked their fields after heavy snowmelt, they noticed something curious. The soil under the living lattice stayed soft, workable, and rich long before the surrounding bare fields thawed. Today we know why. A living root system produces carbon compounds even in cold conditions, feeding the microbial community and preserving structure. To apply this in your own garden or homestead, the timing matters more than anything else. The old practice was to sow the blend roughly 4 to 6 weeks before the first frost. That window gives the plants enough time to establish themselves without putting on excessive height that winter winds could damage. In practical terms, you would clear the bed after your summer harvest, rake the soil lightly, broadcast the seed mix evenly, and rake once more to settle the seeds. Watering helps, but even in areas where autumn rains are inconsistent, rye will germinate reliably. Once the living lattice establishes, you really don't need to intervene. Snow can pile on it, freezing rain might flatten it, and sudden thaws can drench it. Still, the lattice reforms and holds, you know. One of the historical accounts from a 19th century Baltic farm describes walking on a rye-vetch winter field without sinking into mud, simply because the roots had knitted the soil together so firmly. That same structure, well, it's what prevents nutrient runoff and mineral leaching today. When spring arrives, the real payoff begins. The cover crop wakes up with surprising speed. Rye shoots upright again, vetch spreads, and the peas send out new growth. At this point you have a choice. You can let the cover crop grow until it's knee-high before cutting it down and turning the biomass into the soil, which creates a flush of nitrogen and organic matter. Or, if you're practicing low-till methods, you can crimp the growth by bending the stems at ground level. This preserves the underground architecture while smothering early weeds. The first settlers who used this method didn't use modern rollers, of course. They simply walked through the fields with heavy boots or rocked wooden boards back and forth over the stalks. The principle is the same today, and just as effective. One practical example. If you have a bed where tomatoes struggled last year due to nutrient loss or compaction, plant the living lattice in that bed over winter. By early spring, after cutting and incorporating the biomass, you'll often find that the soil has lifted itself, becoming looser and darker. Earthworms return sooner, water retention improves, and the spring planting slips into soil that feels more like a well-prepared compost trench than an exhausted field. You know, this technique works on a small balcony garden just as well as on a half-acre plot. In containers, rye and vetch prevent erosion from winter rains, while in raised beds they prevent nutrient loss, and in open ground they stop wind erosion that can steal a full inch of topsoil in a single harsh season. You know, the living lattice isn't exactly a modern innovation. It's really a rediscovery, something folks have been doing for ages, and, well, we're just picking it up again. And it's remarkable, honestly, how it stood the test of time across some of the harshest climates humans have ever farmed. That resilience, it's something to admire. If you want soil that wakes up stronger than it went to sleep, this is how you do it. Trust me, There's nothing quite like seeing your soil come alive each spring. If you found this guide valuable, make sure you subscribe to Hydra Haven and, well, share this video with someone who appreciates history-rooted growing methods. It helps the channel grow and, more importantly, ensures these old techniques don't disappear again.